Hi. This afternoon it's about 102 degrees here in Texas. That's about 40 for those of you in Celsius land. And I want to talk to you today about a certain kind of problem that I haven't yet figured out how to think about. I think it's an important issue, one that's really been underexplored. It's something that emerges in Robert Brandom's analysis of Heidegger. And it seems to me a very deep kind of issue that deserves a lot of attention, but hasn't gotten it. So let me explain Brandom's entree via Heidegger, and we'll then generalize it to some other issues involving a dispute that's been occurring over the last 15 years or so between Jacques Derrida and Jürgen Habermas. But it seems to me to have a very broad philosophical significance as well. So let's start with Brandom on Heidegger. Heidegger distinguishes things viewed from an objective point of view from those viewed from a more pragmatic point of view. He distinguishes things present, vorhanden, from those that are ready to hand, like the hammer that is his favorite example, zuhanden. And the idea here is that some things we view as to be used, they present themselves to us as to be used. We're already fully immersed, fully engaged in the world, and we perceive objects as things we can use. Other objects we perceive, and those objects themselves we can perceive, from a purely objective standpoint, looking at them purely as they are, as opposed to what use they might be to us. Now, I think the issue here for Heidegger is which of these is primary. And he takes an unusual view in philosophy. He thinks that the objective is actually secondary. Things primarily present themselves to us as things to be used. We are, after all, thoroughly immersed and engaged in the world, and so we perceive things as things we can use, things that are standing in relation to us. And he takes that as fundamental. Now, Brandom has a very interesting way of looking at this. He raises a question, and I don't know if Heidegger raises this question. I'm not sure at all that he does, but Brandom does, and I think it's an intriguing question. What about that distinction itself? That is to say, the distinction between the vorhandene and the zuhandene. That is to say, things that are just viewed as there, and things that are there for us, things that are ready to hand. Let's just summarize those as the objective and the pragmatic views. That distinction between the objective and the pragmatic, is that distinction itself objective or pragmatic? So if I judge that a hammer is to be used, for example, is that judgment, the judgment that that is a practical judgment, okay? So I'm now talking about a higher order judgment, the judgment that that is a matter of viewing it from a practical point of view. Is that itself a practical point of view that I'm taking when I do that? Or is it an objective point of view? Brandom's interpretation of Heidegger is that by saying the ready to hand is primary, he means that the distinction between the objective and the pragmatic is itself pragmatic, that it is itself ready to hand. Now, you don't have to take that view, of course. You could think that there is a legitimate distinction here, and even think that the pragmatic has some degree of priority without thinking that it's a pragmatic matter whether something is being viewed pragmatically or objectively. Now, to be clear, Heidegger does think that the ready to hand is prior to the merely present. He thinks that fundamental ontology is the regional ontology of Dasein, which is what he means here. He really means that our way of ordering the world is built around our position in the world, and so he takes that as fundamental, the ready to hand, the pragmatic view of things as fundamental. Brandom interprets that as him thinking that the distinction between the objective and the pragmatic is itself pragmatic. Now, I think that's an intriguing question, and we can ask it about a wide range of philosophical distinctions. Is the distinction between the a priori and a posteriori itself a priori, or is it a posteriori? Is the distinction between the analytic and the synthetic analytic or synthetic? And the way of making that more precise is to say, suppose we have a judgment like 2 plus 2 is 4, and we say that's a priori. Is that statement itself, that 2 plus 2 is a priori, itself a priori? Or is it an a posteriori judgment? What about the claim that trees have leaves? Is that a judgment that is a priori or a posteriori? And if it's a posteriori, then we can say, is that judgment itself, that trees have leaves, is a posteriori? Is that a posteriori? Anyway, those kinds of questions, those higher order questions, seem to me intriguing and well worth investigating. But Brandom continues, saying that for Heidegger, this isn't the full story. That is to say, the merely present is secondary to the ready to hand, and he thinks therefore that the pragmatic view has primacy, specifically in the sense that our judgments of what is objective and what is pragmatic are themselves pragmatic. But he says, actually, don't think that's the end of the story, because really it is some third thing. It is a social distinction. It is part of Mitdasein, or being together with others in the world, that leads us to draw these distinctions. So relative to just the focus on the two of them, we have to say that it is the ready to hand that is primary, the pragmatic view of the world. When we take a step back, we see that the lines being drawn are being drawn as part of our social interactions with others in the world. They are part of the field of Mitdasein. So we're not just talking about the regional ontology of Dasein, but really the regional ontology of Mitdasein. That means that in the end, the distinction between the objective and the pragmatic is, in his view, a social distinction. Now, I think it's interesting to think both about this question in the large sense, and also to wonder what sense it makes to say that relative to these two, we've got the distinction between the objective and the pragmatic being pragmatic, but then taking a step back and including a larger perspective, we see it as actually in the end social. I think those are hard questions to sort out, and I'm not going to be able to sort them out here. I'm still working on trying to fully sort them out and understand the options here. But I do want to talk about the utility of using this distinction to illumine various philosophical debates. Whether it applies to Heidegger or not, and by the way, that's controversial, I do think it's something that applies to a lot of philosophical problems and philosophical perspectives.